Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of two sessions, Diversified Farming Systems and Multifunctional Agriculture and Interdisciplinary Convergence. I just wanted to give a brief word about why we decided to do this. Alistair Isles, Liz, and I organized this session, and we thought it would be really interesting to have these very brief talks so that we could all get a good perspective on the various activities that touch on diversified farming systems that are ongoing on campus. More specifically, Alistair and I are interested in understanding this suite of activities because we're interested in promoting a Center for Diversified Farming Systems, and our first talk today, actually by Dan McGrath, is going to explore this in a little bit more detail. And the other thing that we hope will emerge from this is that there will be some cross-pollination and possibly new collaborations that might emerge among researchers and among research groups through these activities. As I mentioned, this is the first of two. The second is going to be on April 27th, and we'll be hearing from a whole other suite of people. Also, very unfortunately, Alistair was called away today and couldn't be here. Otherwise, he would definitely be here. But we'll be videotaping the session, so he'll be able to see it. I'll be taking detailed notes. And because they are speed talks, I don't want to spend much more time. I just want to give you the ground rules. Each speaker will only have 5 minutes to speak. And at 4 minutes, Liz is going to stand up and give a warning so you know that it's time to wrap up. We're not going to do questions at the end of each talk, but instead we'll do questions at the end of each set of talks. And we have 3 sets of talks. The first is looking at multifunctionality. The second is societies, cities, and diversified farming systems. And the third is governance of diversified farming systems. And the hope is that we'll have 10 or 15 minutes as a sort of panel discussion for you, the audience, and the people who talk to discuss the talks that happened. And my last point is that if you are giving a talk, would you please sign the video sign release form, which is at the back of the room. If you haven't already done so, you can do that at the end of the session. So without further ado, we'll go on. Dan McGrath, Executive Director of the Berkeley Institute for the Environment, making cross-disciplinary connections, building a Center for Diversified Farming Systems at Berkeley.
Thank you, Claire. Hello.
Hello.
Alistair's ask to me was to provide an institutional perspective and how BIE thinks about diversified farm systems. And as you may or may not know, BIE is a university-wide unit. There's 5 university-wide centers and institutes called New Initiative Centers. And our job is to link everybody together. And that's a hard task at UC Berkeley. To answer the questions directly, how does BIE see DFS? Well, we've worked really hard to coalesce a roundtable and created a number of roundtables around the themes of diversified farm systems and multifunctional agriculture and natural capital in an agricultural sense. And Claire was the faculty leader of one of those roundtables, and it's really evolved and grown. And at this time, we're working really hard to create a Center for Diversified Farm Systems. And institutionally, that is a challenge. There's a lot of resources that are required to institutionalize it. And I don't want to bore you with that kind of information, but I think it matters. One important idea that I want to share is this notion of the Anthropocene. And this is a term that's been being bandied about here at Berkeley, and everyone seems to like it, that it's really Berkeley's role to provide a blueprint for the Anthropocene. And what is the Anthropocene? It is the age in which we live. It is the age in which the human capacity has outpaced our own understanding of the impacts of our human capacity. And the fact that the natural capital systems on which our whole fabric of society is based are unraveling through the enormous generation of externalities. And so we see diversified farm systems as another lens for providing that blueprint for the environmental sustainability of natural capital systems. And certainly agricultural patterns and agricultural systems is an important aspect because it links so directly to functioning ecosystems, biodiversity, stability, and other issues like that. So as I mentioned, the Center for DFS is in motion. And we are currently working to communicate the need to a major donor to provide the seed funding to enable the hiring of core staff, to operationalize the proposals that may occur. And Claire has been an incredible leader in developing a research agenda. Last year, our research agenda was hammered out with a number of institutional players, including the University of Davis and their Sustainable Agricultural Institute. I know that that's not exactly the title, but the important I want to also add is that there's a growing movement at UC Berkeley to really see our constitutional mandate of public service in a new light. There's a white paper being floated now to really codify what public service is, separate from research, which is the generation of new knowledge, and the instruction and teaching role, which obviously is the creation of PhDs and the creation of new knowledge through the instructional pattern. But this idea that what is it that we need to communicate to the government of California, what is it that we need to communicate to the public about the importance of diversified farm systems, and what role does that play in a new center? And I really can't answer that question directly, but I can provide a request that you think about how public service and the transference of knowledge that is generated within UC Berkeley can be effectively placed on the table at the places where the decisions are being made and how agriculture moves forward in California. And so my one last point is that I think the critical institutional aspect is that a PhD program in diversified farming systems or multifunctional agriculture be outlined that would enable the graduate group, which would be the collection of faculty, to produce an interdisciplinary PhD through the graduate college. And that would really enable the communication of the need to external groups that would really want to help support the success of this idea. Thank you.
Okay, normally we're supposed to have David Silverman speaking, but it looks like he's not here right yet. So I'm going to speak, and then maybe we can fit him in later. Uh-oh. Okay, so my title is, Are They Perfect Substitutes? Landscape versus Local Scale Diversity Effects on Pest Control and Pollination Services. So I'm going to dive right into the ecology of diversified farming systems. And we think of diversified farming systems as being systems that are diversified from the plot to the field and landscape scale, or from the local scale to the landscape scale, through a utilization of a variety of farming practices. And these farming practices produce ecosystem services that are critical inputs to the farming operation itself, and so it's a regenerative system. Well, not all diversified farming systems would necessarily use this entire suite of techniques, and in particular, farmers have control of what's in their own plots and fields, but they don't necessarily have control over the landscape context. They're situated in a given landscape context, and they can't necessarily control what surrounding landowners are going to do, nor can they pick up their farm necessarily and move it to a more favorable landscape context. So for most services, more than one technique and scale can favorably influence that service. This is certainly the case for pollination services, but I've indicated with a thicker line here that it's thought that at the landscape scale actually has the most effect on some of these services like pest control and pollination. So the question then becomes for a grower is to what extent can techniques that are actually under the farmer control, that is at the local scale, the field or plot scale, to what extent can those techniques actually substitute for the positive effects of landscape complexity on some of these services? And so I'm going to talk about this very briefly with respect to work that we've already done on pest control. This is work done by Rebecca Chaplin-Kramer in my lab. and also what we're planning to do on pollination services. So what we do is we study farms in different landscape situations, and these yellow farms, these farms over here, the farms at the center of these landscape plots are surrounded by a very homogeneous agricultural landscape. So these would be what we call our agriculturally dominated landscapes. And then over here we have 5 other farms, again at the center of these plots, that are surrounded by a complex landscape with mostly natural habitat around it. And in this system we've been looking at broccoli farms and at the control of aphid pests on these broccoli farms. And we've added another layer to this, which is the local status of the farm at the center of those plots. So we have some farms that are locally simple, they're monocultures of broccoli, and we have other farms that are locally diverse. They have different crops being grown in the same field, and they may also have other floral resources such as hedgerows and other aspects that diversify at the plot scale. So we end up with 4 situations. We have locally simple farms in an agricultural landscape, locally diverse farms in an agricultural landscape, locally simple farms in a complex, heterogeneous landscape, and locally diverse farms, again, in a complex, heterogeneous landscape. So we have a sort of gradient from least diversified to most diversified when you consider both local and landscape factors. And what we find in this study, it's a cage study where we place aphids on broccoli plants that are open to natural enemies and that are closed to natural enemies, and we compare the growth in both of those situations. And we look at the proportional reduction in aphid densities. So I'll just walk you through this one graph. And what we find, if you just concentrate on the early season initially, what we find is that, not surprisingly, the landscape factor, the natural landscape, the darker green here, has much more proportional reduction in aphid densities, much more pest control than either locally diverse or locally simple farms in the agricultural landscapes. But in the late season, what we start to see is a substitution effect, because here, for the locally diverse farms only, even when they're in the agricultural landscape, they start to have an equivalent level of pest reduction to those farms that are in the more natural landscapes, whether they're simple or diverse farms. So here we start to see a substitution effect, and we start to see that by the late season, that grower techniques that they can actually utilize on their farms are actually making a difference in terms of pest control, and it's not just the landscape complexity. And my final point is that we haven't started this study yet, but working in a similar area in Monterey Bay, the Monterey Bay region, we would like to do a similar study on strawberry pollination, again, comparing organic monoculture versus polyculture farms situated on a landscape gradient of complexity. Thank you. So, should we go on with questions then? You can do that. Sure. Okay, so we have the opportunity right now for Dan to come up, and we have a little bit of time, I'm not sure how much, but Liz will tell us, for questions on this section before we move on, if there are any questions, before we move on to societies, cities, and diversified farming systems. So if anybody has any questions for those very rapid presentations that we gave.
How can we find the white paper on the UCB public service?
I don't believe it's available to the public. I believe that it's currently being drafted for review by the Chancellor. But I could find out if there is an opportunity for a comment by the community, the UC Berkeley community at large on that.
Thank you for your presentation. This question is for Dr. Kremlin. So does the size of the farm affect the level of pest control in the different systems?
Yeah, it probably does. I mean, one of the things that's hard to separate out is that often the more diversified farms are also smaller, so they have more edges, and they have so that definitely can have an influence. It can be pretty difficult to to define, what exactly do we mean by diversified farming systems and, more diverse versus a less diverse farm. So that's one of the challenges in this kind of research.
This is a question for Dan. Are each of the centers on campus being considered kind of one by one? Because I know that there are several that have just come online, there's more that are coming. Or I'm wondering, is there kind of a university master plan for the next 10 centers that are coming? I'm just wondering where this fits in.
I think the best way to answer that is essentially Berkeley is structured like a spreadsheet. The columns are the fundamental disciplines of the American Academy, and the colleges and schools represent those agglomerations of disciplines. On the rows are centers and institutes which may or may not straddle multiple schools and and colleges and schools. And the unique thing about UC Berkeley is we have a third dimension called the graduate groups, and there are 43 graduate groups. And UC Berkeley has an extraordinary capacity to rapidly move into an emerging discipline by creating a graduate group that has the authority, based upon approval of the Faculty Senate, to produce a PhD in that area. That's what QB3 is. That's what the Energy and Resources Group, it was the very first graduate group. So multidisciplinary lenses on looking at a very important critical problem for humanity can emerge. And so Berkeley has a framework to allow students and faculty to align along that. And we're the only university in the country that has that. So the question is there a strategic plan for institutes and centers? I would say yes, the Vice Chancellor of Research does have a sense of a broad theme, and the fundamental organizing principle for the emergence of new centers and institutes is along the lines of climate change and energy. But I think there is a great respect for the faculty to self-organize themselves along those ways in which it's best to communicate new knowledge. So it's not a top-down. Berkeley is a faculty-centric place.
We can take a couple more.
Yeah, Dan, quick question just about the sort of vision for the center. The program today really is representative of these interdisciplinary convergence. And you talked about the center straddling these different disciplinary divides. I'm just curious to what extent you do foresee the center itself as really bringing together the ecology with, social science questions that are coming up, not only in urban or in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And thinking, I guess, more broadly than just beyond diversified farming systems, but also thinking about agri-food systems or food systems more broadly.
Well, the answer is yes. We're working with former Dean Harrison Fraker, who to create a center for urban metabolism, because this is a dominant growing concept, and I think there would be tremendous pollination to have diversified farm systems provide intellectual content to a center for urban metabolism. So, I mean, I would say yes, absolutely. There's also an effort to produce a center for environmental social science integration, which would also have enormous linkages to diversified farm systems and multifunctional agriculture.
Maybe if I can add also to that question, in our discussion so far about graduate programming for the diversified farming systems and developing perhaps a designated emphasis in this, we've really been thinking about agri-food systems. Diversified farming system, one of the problems with the name is that it seems somewhat limited, and so we've also thought about much longer and complex titles, and then always come back to diversified farming systems because they're too much of a mouthful. But yeah, I think the intent is to go much beyond the actual ecology and also to the food system itself.
I think the growing paradigm for BIE is that we are open conversation zone, and that we want to be the mechanism which allows any faculty or student to participate in any way that they want to in a growing intellectual theme.
Is there one more?
This is a question. When you showed the temporal aspect to the pest control, and then you mentioned that was a substitution effect, I was wondering what you meant by substitution. And I was also wondering why it's restarted every year. What are the main causes and why it didn't hold over to the next year?
So that was all within 1 year. It was just early and late season within 1 year. And so what we think is that the natural enemies don't actually build up that quickly on the farm sites, and so it may take a while for them to really get going. And that is a problem. It could be that growers are not going to experience enough pest control early in the field season for this to be sort of an economically viable way of managing pest control. I'm sorry, now I forgot the first part of your question. It was.
Well, I just meant so the substitution.
Oh, the substitution. What I meant was, can local factors, like such that growers can do themselves, they can choose to diversify their cropping strategy, they can choose to integrate hedgerows or not, can that substitute for the strong effect of landscape complexity? And it appears that by the late season in this pest control system, it can. That the amount of pest control that growers are getting on diversified farms in simple landscapes is actually not statistically different from the amount of pest control that growers are getting, whether they're on a simple farm or a diverse farm in a heterogeneous landscape. So it actually seems to be a perfect substitute at the late season. So I think maybe we should...
Maybe just take Sybil's question.
Oh, there's
and then we
Sybil.
can-
Yeah, sorry.
I was curious if within the range of centers working on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary questions, is there a definition of the interdisciplinary PhD that you like?
Yes, there is a definition. You can go onto the graduate college's website and identify any faculty group can petition the dean of the graduate college to accept a PhD proposal that's multidisciplinary. So a very exceptional, brilliant student can create their own PhD here at UC Berkeley on any topic upon approval by the faculty senate.
Okay, well, so we're going to go on now to the second section, which is Society, Cities, and Diversified Farming Systems. And our first speaker is Nathan McClintock. I think you have a
Yes, that should be there somewhere.
Yeah.
All right, hi everybody. I'm Nathan McClintock. I'm wrapping my dissertation up in the geography department here at UC Berkeley. The title of my talk today is Filled with Alliteration, Assessing Urban Agriculture's Origins and Opportunities in Oakland. That was actually not intentional, it just sort of came out that way. And so essentially, I'm just going to sort of talk about the different components of my research. I have had a foot in the door of geography, ESPM, and city planning my whole time. This is why I brought up this question about how much cities factor into the vision of what diversified farming systems are. I've been really interested in the rise of this urban agriculture movement in Oakland. It's East Bay wide, but particularly in Oakland, there's been a lot of activity with food justice movements and organizations such as City Slicker Farms, Village Bottoms Farm Planning Justice, Oakland Food Connection, People's Grocery, Kijiji Grows, Fat Meats Produce. So the first part of my dissertation, I'm really taking a more social science approach and trying to understand the rise of these different organizations. What has really fueled this mass expanse in the last few years of urban agriculture as this sort of rallying energy. So the first part of the dissertation, I'm really kind of trying to trace this back to some previous social movements in Oakland, such as the Black Panther Party, their free breakfast program, also looking at the environmental justice movement that was very active in particularly in the 90s and 2000s. Then also connecting it to a lot of the urban garden education stuff that was starting up at Berkeley in the 90s. And then also really trying to make sense of the different flows of funding that were going in and allowing this movement to really take off and take hold. Something that I'm concerned with also is the interaction between public spaces, public parks, etc., and these different organizations and the relationships that they have. A big question that I'll be presenting on at the geography conferences next week in Seattle is this question of, are these organizations, as state social services sort of pull back in this quote, neoliberal era that we like to talk about in the social sciences, are organizations like this coming in and actually providing food security and really taking the role of provisioning food and access to food in a way that perhaps the state should be doing. So that's just this fundamental tension that's constantly arising. I said I do a lot in the planning department as well. And so the planning component of my dissertation really arose out of my work with some of these different organizations. So I was part of the HOPE Collaborative for a while, which is a Kellogg-funded program looking to improve the, quote, health for Oakland's people and environments. That's what HOPE stands for. And one of the needs that they wanted, that they and other urban ag organizations had, was to really identify how much space would there be for urban agriculture in Oakland. How much land is there available? How much food could we potentially grow? How much of a contribution to Oakland's food systems could we make? So with a mini grant from the HOPE Collaborative and the help of an undergraduate research assistant, we did this semester-long vacant land inventory in Oakland, looking at just public land. And overall, we identified about 495 sites, totaling about 1,200 acres. I've since done slope analysis using GIS and brought that number down to about 800 acres below 30% slope for farming. Overall, if you were to take half of that land and then integrating food production onto half of that land into a sort of mixed-use type setting, that would you would be able to meet about 5% of Oakland's recommended USDA recommended vegetable needs on that amount of land. That was a part of the research project. The next part I mentioned that I spent a lot of time at ESCOM as well. I have a background in sustainable ag, and I'm very interested in soils. And so there was an environmental justice question that came up, which was, if we're expanding urban agriculture in all of these areas, do we risk exposing people to different toxins? And so breaking down the soils into different types where we might find urban ag, gardens, vacant lots, open space, and existing city parks. We took soil samples. I say we, it's some undergraduate research assistants and I, and really tried to see if there were trends. Were lead levels higher, for example, in West Oakland as they were in other parts of the city? Were they higher in vacant lots and existing garden spaces than in parks and open spaces? Really to just kind of get a sense of where are we going to potentially run into these types of environmental obstacles to spreading urban agriculture. I'm going to skip over some of the other part on the bottom. The last part of it is really a question about policy. I'm on the Oakland Food Policy Council. My work as a graduate student has filtered into something that you guys would have just received in your mailboxes today. I sent out an announcement about our latest plug for what the OFPC's stance on urban agriculture and protecting and spreading urban agriculture. So I will let you look in your inboxes to see that, to understand how that last part of my dissertation work has filtered into that. So, thanks. Sorry for going over.
Okay, our next speaker is Christy Gatz. She's going to talk about social context and implication of diversified food systems.
No, I don't have PowerPoints to do that. Okay, so I've got 5 minutes, so we'll see how quickly I can speak. Most of my research does not directly address diversified farming at the farm level. I would say with regards to this topic, my work has a much broader net and allows me more easily to sort of address what I would call the topic of diversified agro-food systems, which relates to your previous question, looking not only at biological or crop diversity, but at other forms of diversity, racial diversity, social diversity, scale, economic, etc. So briefly, since I only have a couple minutes, I'm going to just hit on 3 different topics. One is the issue of scale, which I think is really important when we're thinking about diversified farming systems and food systems. The diversity that's driving the growth of the small farm sector in particular. And finally, the paradox of diversity in the agricultural labor regime. With regards to scale, so imagine agriculture in the United States is sort of an hourglass with a really large top, an increasingly small middle, and a small but somewhat growing bottom. And this would be the case for both, this sort of picture, this hourglass would be the same for both the conventional sector and the organic sector, which I've done a lot of my own research on. Just to give you some data in this regard, in 2006, 70% of the organic acreage in California was controlled by the top 5% of farms, operations, and 2% of the acreage was controlled by the smallest 50% of farms. Perhaps more meaningful would be to think of this by sales. 7% of operations, organic operations in California accounted for 75% of sales. while 75% of organic operations accounted for just 7% of sales. The conventional sector is similar. If we look at the nation as a whole between 2002 and 2007, we're seeing increasing concentration, as we all know, with an increase of 46,000 farms with sales greater than $500,000. However, at the bottom, we are seeing increasing diversification, both in terms of the demographic makeup of farm operators and in terms of on-farm cropping patterns. Interestingly, the growth in the bottom part of this hourglass is now dominated by very, very small farms with very low annual sales. These farms are notably hobby farms, lifestyle farms, residential farms, and retirement farms. Between 2002 and 2007, nationwide there was an increase of 74,000 farms with annual sales of less than $2,500 a year. Well, why should we care about scale? Certainly some research has been done on this sort of disappearing middle ag sector, notably the Leopold Center. But I think it's really important as we think about diversified farming and food systems that we should continue to unpack the implications of this phenomenon and sort of thinking about the implications of scale for diversified food systems. And a quick aside, some of my previous research showed that larger mid-sized all-organic growers, particularly those with diversified cropping patterns and direct sales, were more likely to provide above-average wages and benefits to farm workers, just a quick aside. In addition to this growth in the bottom of these hobby or lifestyle farms, we've seen pretty rapid growth in immigrant and minority-operated farms. 10% growth between 2002 and 2007 nationwide. In California, minority and immigrant-operated farms made up 40% of new farms over the last 10 years and currently comprise more than 20% of all farms in California. Interestingly, recent research I've conducted with Nancy Puliso and Jennifer Sauerwein indicate a pervasive climate of under-enforcement of labor, health, and safety regulations on very large farms, but targeted over-enforcement of these regulations on some of the very smallest, most marginal minority-operated farms in the valley. So that's just another quick aside, but something interesting to think about. And other research I've conducted has shown that these farms play an important role in addressing food security challenges within their own community. So let me just quickly end with last comments relating to the role of labor in the demographic diversity of the food system. I think it's important to remember that our food and ag system rests on the back, from a societal standpoint, of a diverse demographic, primarily Hispanic farm workers from Mexico and Central America, and that historically waves of immigrants have become workers on farms, including the Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and others. And perhaps most importantly, the processes by which these immigrant groups have kind of gone through the labor system has been enabled by racist citizenship, immigration, and regulatory policies. So I think it's important as we discuss diversified farming systems not to forget the role of these diverse groups and the role they've played over time, and to think constructively about moving toward a food system that incentivizes not only environmental sustainability, but also social well-being of the diverse range of actors in the food system.
Thank you, Chrissy. Our next speaker is Laura Ann Mainfly from Geography, and she is speaking on migrations of hunger and knowledge, farm worker food insecurity in California.
Thank you so much. I'm Laura Ann Mainfly. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Geography department as well. It's really fortunate that I get to follow Christy Getz, actually, because she sets up my research really well, and actually not just in this setting. My research on farm worker food insecurity is actually, I'm not actually arguing, or I'm not actually proving the point that it exists, because Christy and some colleagues have already done that research. So CIRS, the California Institute for Rural Studies, did a study in 2006 that showed overwhelming food insecurity for farm workers in California. It's not the only study that's done that. There's also been a study in North Carolina. So what my study does is, based on that research, is looking actually at coping strategies of farm workers in the food system, how they deal with that food insecurity, and how this relates to the structural causes of food insecurity. So taking a political ecology or political economy approach, understanding how food insecurity relates to immigration policies, and racialized exploitation of farm workers. So my case study, been doing ethnographic research in the northern central coast of California. So that's in San Benito, Monterey, and Santa Cruz counties. And I've had a particular focus with indigenous Oaxacan populations, as they're a growing population in the labor force in California right now and tend to be the most highly exploited really on both sides of the border. So in doing my ethnographic work, I've been looking at 3 different kind of coping strategies or processes that are happening. The first one is food assistance programs, so looking at the utilization and kind of organization of food banks and food pantries, as well as other types of outreach programs for farm workers that are being done by nonprofits and also by the health departments in these counties. So I've been sitting in on health and nutrition collaborative meetings and interviewing the actors in those systems, as well as talking to farm workers about how they utilize them or don't and why. And then I've been looking at a community garden project that's completely run by farm workers themselves in Hollister, California. So I'm looking at that as kind of an example. I think it's a pretty rare example, but I'm also looking at that in relation to home gardens that are happening in very small scale all over these counties. And then the third kind of case study I'm looking at is farm workers transitioning to become farmers, which Christy mentioned in California is happening. It actually is happening. And so it's actually in large part to ALBA, which is the Agricultural and Land-Based Training Association out of Salinas, where they train anyone low income, but it's majority farm workers to become farmers. So I've been sitting in on the classes that they conduct there and doing interviews with the staff as well. So I'm using these case studies in order to understand the ways that class, race, and ethnicity play out in the food system in terms of how people are able to access resources or not, and how they're able to improve food access and livelihoods. My research contradicts the dominant narrative which claims that low-income people and people of color don't have knowledge about healthy eating. So one reason that I'm really interested in looking at gardens and farm plots is looking at the ways that immigrants come here with a very diverse set of knowledges about food and about farming, and the ways that kind of a lot of food assistance programs reach out in somewhat a misinformed way, assuming that people don't know how to eat well, rather than actually looking at the food access and land access issues. So I think most relevant to this group, and something that I was really interested in when I started my research, is understanding how knowledge is traveling across the border. And that's, I think, really relevant in the way that immigrants are starting small farms and the ways that they're using both knowledge from farming in Mexico. A lot of them come from being smallholding farmers in Mexico and then go, ironically, to being laborers on large and small farms in California. So how they're using their knowledge from Mexico, as well as the knowledge that they're gaining from farming systems here, and combining that information to start small farms. Additionally, I'm looking at the way that these small farms have an effect on changing kind of the face of farming, so the racial makeup of farming and how significant that is. Ultimately, I argue that while inequalities in the food system really have their structural and causes, and this is very much related to poverty, this is not just about food. But I also argue that we have to look at the ways that that people that are suffering from these inequalities are holders of knowledge and are actors in this system, and that in order to understand solutions, we need to see them as actors and not just people that are being acted upon. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura Ann. That's great. So the next talk is Annie Chang from the School of Public Health, and she's speaking on diversifying the urban food system, migrant communities in the South Bay.
Hi, it's a really great pleasure to speak on this particular panel. Just to give you a context, I'm a first-year medical student. My background has been in immigration and migration, specifically looking at cultural and linguistic issues. And this is sort of my brainstorming process because this is my first year and I'm beginning a career of research, especially in health. And I'm currently a resident of Santa Clara County, so if you guys don't know this area really well, it used to be known as the Valley of the Heart's Delight. So it was largely agricultural, known for our fruit, and it spanned the entire valley. Unfortunately, there were three main forces that drove the significant changes of our county's landscape. First was development, so you see urban sprawl, big box development, urbanization. And then the second was technology. So Santa Clara County is also known as Silicon Valley now. So you see most of the computer firms and industries localized there. And due to that, you see also a pool of migration. So Santa Clara County is incredibly diverse. So just to give you a sense of that diversity, over 1 in 3 of our residents is from a foreign country. In California, that ratio is 1 in 4. So we have a bit higher foreign-born population. And about nearly 50% of our residents are racial minorities. It could be higher just because of the enumeration issues regarding some populations. So this incredible diversity is reflected in my own experience. My grandparents were from rural Taiwan post-World War II. My parents also grew up in that setting, but attained secondary education in Taiwan and then migrated to the United States. My father was an electrical engineer and landed in Silicon Valley. So as you can see, each migrant community will come to the valley for various reasons. We have various communities that weren't driven by technology. They come as either migrant workers, they come either due to refugee or political turmoil. So the migration experience is very diverse. So due to the dynamic diversity, we also see a wealth of food, cultural, and agricultural heritage. That's this wealth of knowledge, and this concept of knowledge and how knowledge is kind of inherited, passed on within generations and shared with the larger society is very interesting to me. So since my work, my action-based work, my community involvement, is basically localized in a local urban farming project. And because we are an urban farming project, we deal with the issues of equity, so mainly social justice, food justice, and environmental justice. So the issue of equity is central to our work. And because just driving down to San Jose, you see the dynamic intersections of the economy, and you see the interactions with the landscapes of our valley, and also the social dynamics within each community and their different backgrounds. So the model of our farm is basically to have everybody work on the same piece of land. Currently we have 2 acres in the agricultural park. The goal is to expand to 10 acres. So this is a different model than having individual plots where a community just rents out a plot of land or have it in their backyard. The goal is integration and community building, because with this shared space, we're allowed to not only incorporate people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also of age, different SES levels, profession. We have computer engineers out with environmental scientists as credicing. And we also have different educational levels. So we have high school youth coming in with different professors. So the research that I'm hoping to look further into is combining agroecology with agro-heritage. So for example, how can the heritage of these rich migrant communities increase crop yields in our local farm? So the SFA area has about 30% food insecurity. It's pretty significant. And then diversifying the crop varieties. So far, we have successfully planted taro. It's a tropical plant, but we were able to successfully plant it here in the Mediterranean climate. Orgra, and the Trinity, the corn, squash, and bean. So it's really been interesting to see that. And lastly is environmental resource management. So how to integrate native pest control strategies such as hedgerows with sort of planting strategies from heritages. So my mother was teaching us that the reason that the yield of your broccoli isn't significant is because you don't trim the leaves off the stalk. So all the nutrients and all the water goes to the leaves. And so the sprouts you have are quite insignificant. So yeah, I just wanted to end with that.
up now and take some questions, that would be great. Yeah. I don't know how many minutes. How many minutes we have?
Let's say about 15.
We have about 15 minutes for questions. My question is for Laura. Well, I guess for Laura and Christy both. It's about ALBA and the interesting remarks that you both made about this really great growth in small farms that are being run by immigrant former farm workers. And I'm wondering, I think you said that ALBA had a great deal to do with it. Can you sort of go into that in a bit more detail? Is it pretty much because of ALBA that this is happening in California, or are there other factors as well?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there's like a direct answer to that. I think that ALBA, and just in my observations in the Bay Area, when I've been trying to figure out who are immigrant farmers that are selling in the Bay Area, I'm finding a lot of them have a connection to ALBA, but ALBA's also had different formations over the years. So the training program that it has now, it's a very intensive 6-month training program. It hasn't been around actually for that long, but it's been kind of a center, I think, that a lot of people have been involved with for a long time. So I think it's a good question. I don't know the exact answer as to how much that's happening outside of ALBA. And you have a
Yeah, no, I mean, I think ALBA's played a big role in the Central Coast area, and I mean, I'm guessing, 300 or 400 farmers maybe, have sort of been connected to ALBA or got ownership. But there's a lot of farmers, new farmers in the Central Valley, all around the Central Valley, that aren't connected to ALBA. I mean, the work that Nancy and I have been doing, and you've done a little bit with us, is on Southeast Asian refugee farmers, and easily 1,000 in the Fresno area. So and I bet a lot of those aren't even captured by the census. So there's a number of refugee farmers who've been farming, maybe been here for a while, but have just gotten into farming in the last 10 years. And then there's also minority-owned farms, but again, African-American, very few in the state, maybe 25 or 30. Do you know Nathan? No.
The census says 250, but it's been very hard to find.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, I think there's a lot of different mechanisms for that increase.
I would just add that elsewhere in the country, there's many other programs similar to what ALBA is doing. Some of them are run through cooperative extension, and some of them are run through universities. So there's a program out of Tufts in Massachusetts. There's a program in New York, one right outside of New York City. There's another one that Cornell.
Yeah, and our cooperative extension small farm advisors work a lot with immigrant and minority farmers. Down in San Diego, we have Ramiro Lobo, and he's working with a number of Hispanic farmers. So I don't know exactly how they're getting in, but and how many of them were former farm workers, but it's definitely on the rise. Nate, can you be our facilitator?
For Christy, the hourglass image that you asked us to think about with the very small farms producing less than $2,500. Do you think that an expansion of lifestyle farms and hobby farms could actually be a solution or be a mechanism for the creation of more sustainable food chain structures?
I think that definitely plays an important role. I think the danger is counting on, the danger is having this completely polarized food system where you have super large concentrated industrialist farms juxtaposed with super, super small. I think we need that middle. But I do think that the small lifestyle farmers are increasingly playing an important role, and we see that in the Bay Area for sure. The 1 acre farm that's supplying, niche markets. But I think it's really important to think about ways of sort of supporting that middle in terms of sort of land stewardship issues, social issues. I don't know, that's just my normative stance on it. But
just to add, one of the big pushes for urban and municipal farming is these zoning changes, and that's what we're working on in Oakland now. In San Francisco is just allowed sales for residential gardens, and there's been a big mobilization from urban growers to actually make it legal to actually grow not only for themselves but also to feed into the food system. That's what Nancy's saying.
I have a question for you and one for Annie. Nathan, I was just wondering when you were identifying the empty land with the GIS stuff, is that basically empty land just as it appears on the images? And if you also cross that with looking at, land title records or leasing records and things like
Sure.
that?
Yeah, so I can just quickly answer that. That was basically, it was just looking at publicly owned land, so we had already sorted it for that. I did actually do another search for an identification of privately owned land, but basically that was all publicly owned.
And my question for Annie is, I was wondering, you're working with a different model of kind of a not collective, but 2-acre, everybody's working on. I wanted to say a little bit more about how you either recruit people to work there, if you have some kind of a way of ensuring some kind of diversity, because you said that was one of the goals of your project is to draw on heritage and so on, or do people come and ask for access? You said it wasn't like a community garden. I just wonder if you could talk about people's access to the land and who ends up getting it and
Sure. Yeah, I think there are multiple strategies. I think sort of our model kind of resonates with themes here. First is the interdisciplinary approach. We outreach, we have Deanne's community colleges around us, as well as the state university, San Jose State University. So a large draw is the diversity from the different campuses. And we make sure that we hit departments that, like art, theater, political, nutrition, etc. So the biggest draw, the strength is our youth. The second is sort of the actual geography of our farm. So we're located in East San Jose. That's the most significantly underserved population, largely Latino and sort of Vietnamese as well as Chinese. So we have to address the equity there, the physical location of that equity. So we do a lot of outreach, bilingual workshops in Spanish, and I think we're starting up in other Asian languages to address that. And also, I think the movement for food justice, environmental justice is so strong that we're actually pulling from different zip codes that are actually maybe 30 minutes away, up to Palo Alto, which is like not even in San Clara Valley. So I think it's just finding these intersections of what people are passionate about. And my particular, I want to look at is elders, specifically underserved elders that are kind of usually more marginalized and tend to be more isolated. So just making sure that their incorporation in this public space is available. And our farm is part of an agricultural park, so that means it's public. So there is no restriction, it's volunteer-based, everything is volunteer-based, and people are welcome to come during work days throughout the week. I hope this answers your question. Yeah.
So who decides what gets planted, who plants what? I'm not understanding, there's no kind of allocation of pieces. You grow your Asian vegetables in one piece and you grow your...
I see. We do have kind of a discussion. We do have community meetings to understand number one, the landscape. We are a Mediterranean climate, so something tropical, unfortunately, may not grow here. So we have to take that into consideration. We do feedbacks from our volunteers. We open a lot of workshops and forums to incorporate feedback, and also the elders who actually come out with the elders, like Italians, Armenians, Latinos, Indian, that contribute to their knowledge about their ecosystem and their heritage. And we try to incorporate that within our various beds. So we have various beds, it's diversified, so we're not monocultural.
So Liz and then Isabel.
There's a really complex immigration politics in this country, obviously, and across this panel there's discussion of both migrant contributions to American agri-food systems and immigrant or refugee contributions. And a lot of you are working in contexts where you would be interfacing with groups that would fit under multiple headings like that. And I'm curious how these politics are playing out on the ground, if there's a sense of a more sort of deserving migrant population, I'm thinking of projects in San Diego, for example, which are explicitly geared towards refugee populations. Are those easier to get off the ground in this political climate than one that serves migrant farm workers who want access to land? Is there any slippage of politics across those categories? Do people kind of get in the door by caring about refugees and then learn about farm workers? I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the politics.
I think I can speak and then I'll open it for other people. From my experience, just focusing on the urban dynamics, I think equity has to be central to urban agriculture. There's just so many backgrounds and so many migration histories. You're right, political refugees, asylees. Are you from, Sudan running from a war? Are you like my father who came for economic reasons? So there's definitely equity central to discussion. And I think my Armenian friends share this with me, and it's really touching. The term for friendship is to eat together. And I think we've lost that with our industrial food system. I think growing up in an urban environment, I have seen segregation of neighborhoods, like certain populations will be in certain parts of San Jose and Santa Clara Valley. And I think urban agriculture and land in general is a way for integration of communities to know these different histories and learn about disparities and inequities, but most importantly to work together to resolve these inequities they face. Because we're also not dealing with the recent migrants, we're dealing with their children and their children out there.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think a really complicated one. I guess the way I would interpret that is kind of like, what are the differences among people on the ground? And I can talk to that just in terms of the farm worker population, which definitely has hierarchies within it. Like second generation, I'm going to talk really generally. Second generation Latinos are kind of in a management position. They speak really great Spanish, and then you have a lot of the community I work with, which is Oaxacan, which are dual language. Some of them speak Triqui or Mixteco or Zapotec, and they're experiencing discrimination not only from, and sometimes, so I'd say not only from kind of the white population, but sometimes even stronger discrimination from the Latino population. And then another complicated factor is actually a lot of the Oaxacans are refugees. So they're getting legal refugee status because they're actually fleeing violence in Oaxaca. So it's some Mexican immigrants now are actually refugees as well. So there's all these complicated levels. And so I guess in terms of the different kinds of access that they're going to get, it really depends, I think, on the situation. One thing I look at in my research is actually how indigeneity as a status has kind of been a strategic way for this Oaxacan community garden I'm looking at. Most of them identify as Triqui or Mixteco, and so they're able to get certain kinds of funding. And so even though they actually don't use the word indigenous, they identify very distinctly as Triqui or Mixteco, not indigenous, but they can get certain kinds of funding in the United States because being indigenous is kind of sexy in the funding world. And it's a really ironic position for them because actually being indigenous is a derogatory concept. So there's all these messy elements, and then one thing I think Christy could talk to is then the larger set of refugees being the Hmong population, and how that's really different than the Latino population because they're actually coming here with their refugee status, and so they actually have better access, even though they have lots of challenges. They're actually in a different class because a lot of them are farming now. They're not farm workers like the Oaxacan population. So it's, you want to...
But ironically, we kind of went into this research project thinking, well, they have refugee status, they're going to have a lot of sort of more opportunities, but there's a couple things really working against them. One is really a lack of sort of institutional support for that particular population. Not a lot from sort of state agencies as well as nonprofits, and a lot of kind of crazy politics, as well as a very hostile regulatory climate that they don't really understand, and it's kind of forced them in some ways into hiding in terms of their farming. So there's some interesting dynamics going on, although they do have sort of, in theory, a more favorable status than, say, an undocumented farm worker, clearly, but it's not all rosy.
So Isabella and then Nancy.
What we just said, Christy, reminds me of some the farmers we work with who say, in this country, you farm with paperwork, in our country, we farm with implements.
That's right. That's exactly right. You got it.
But my question is actually to Nathan and Laura. Do you see examples of municipalities setting aside food belts or community farm belts at the edges of cities for this kind of scale of thought?
I'll leave it to you.
Ignacio.
I want to keep hearing about politics really, and whether you thought about it more explicitly, the intersection between federal, state, and smaller level politics. And if you look into the future, as these trends become more and more visible, more and more economically viable, and so on, what do you guys predict or think about? It's going to be important to be paying attention to, all the way from the federal, looking at it from the top.
Yeah, for me, I think what I would like to see is the joint movements in health and public health, working with environmental science and agricultural policy to really look at immigration policy, to look at equity like minority health, and looking at these different areas that currently are not talking together on a federal level, and it's quite like, for example, like minorities tend to be have food assistance. However, the types of food that they receive are not the ones, number one, that they prefer, and they're definitely not the ones that promote good health. So it's interesting that that the most vulnerable are the ones that also have a rich heritage in agriculture, and none of that knowledge is being tapped into. So I think forums like this are really helpful in that regard for bigger policy and frameworks and concepts.
I would add that there are a lot of the federal and state level regulations are designed very much to favor corporate agriculture, large scale agriculture. And so what you find are, for example, small scale livestock raisers who have 5 animals that they want to get slaughtered. They can't actually find a slaughterhouse that will take such a small order, that will actually allow them to, because if you don't have 100 or 1,000 head, you can't actually get a contract. And then, the regulations are such that it would be illegal for you to do it on your property and then sell the meat. So there are all types of regulations that need to be reworked at the local level to allow for much smaller scale and more diversified farming systems. That this federal level has really been designed for agribusiness and industrial levels. So I think that's really where the key kind of conflicts are taking place, and that's sort of where this role of local food policy councils, who are working not only at the municipal level, but who are advocating for farm bill level change and state level change, like the California Food and Justice Coalition. It's essential that those people are part of these local food policy actions, who are then taking things to Washington and Sacramento. There was a hand.
Can I just add to that really quick? I would just say, I think with the regulation conversations that are happening in ag right now, that they need to happen in a really careful and thoughtful way, because I think what I've heard from some of the proponents of small scale agriculture tends to be kind of more of a libertarian view of, we don't want these regulations. And so rather than an understanding of, regulations need to be applied differently, it's kind of like, we don't want regulations, period. Right? The regulations are really in terms of food safety, and there having to be some kind of government regulation of what's happening in our food system. That's really important. So it can't be this all or nothing. And I think, like Nathan's saying, it needs to not be just geared to big agribusiness. It needs to be scaled at different levels to let low-income, minority, small-scale farmers in, rather than completely debilitating them.
Yeah, let's have some regulations about farm worker safety and wages and things like that, instead of just like regulation is designed to let the biggest guys.
And the sustainable ag sector and the small farm sector hasn't been particularly friendly to many of these regulations as they've come through the halls of state capitals. So.
Right. So did
Laura, this is for you actually. You're mentioning about one part of your dissertation is looking at the fact that knowledge travels across borders. And I'm really interested for the Alba graduates who are managing to thrive on their own or do reasonably well from Mexico specifically. What kinds of farm practices in Mexico, be it intercropping or local seeds or whatever, have transferred well to the California environment specifically? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I think that was actually the biggest question I had when I started my research, was a really big interest in how that agricultural knowledge really travels. And I think, I found that there's a lot of limits to really small scale, and I'm working, like I said, mostly with Oaxacan, coming from very rural areas of Oaxacan. So the way that they farm there, and the way that they're farming, say, in a community garden, or in a market garden in California are actually pretty different. I think that the things that have transferred the best are intercropping. You know, that intercropping is just something, the way that they know how to farm, and that's not something they have to be taught. And particular varieties, so a lot of them are bringing particular Mexican varieties, be it different kinds of beans, different kinds of greens are really the things that actually survive the best. A lot of people have seeds from Mexico that actually did not do that well here because it's a different climate. And then a lot of them are really actually very thrilled to have some of the technology that we have here. So like drip irrigation, you know, versus bringing their buckets, you know, to their to plots. And so I think there's, on one hand, you know, I was really excited to hear people talk about what they've brought. On the other hand, I had to be careful not to like romanticize, you know, this is something I was doing when I started my research, not to romanticize too much, you know, the small scale Mexican agriculture, that a lot of them were very happy to have a tractor, per se, you know, rather than doing everything by hand in the beginning of the season. So I think what I found is it's been a real combination. And that what's really traveled with them is actually their knowledge about health and nutrition. That's been really significant as much as the agricultural knowledge. So really an understanding of what's healthy and what they want to eat. And so, yeah, it's been really an interesting combination, more than I would have thought when I started.
Well, I was sort of struggling to come up with a question also about the knowledge and how it flows forward. And it just occurred to me that when you said that it was really a combination, that in some ways, you know, when we advocate for diversified farming techniques, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying that everything should be small-scale diversified farming techniques, or that it should all be done in a certain way, and that we might want to blend and mix from different traditions. And I guess I'm wondering to what extent you think that these farmers, when they're coming here, bringing that heritage, and not just the ones that you're working with, but also the ones that you're working with, Annie, and Christy as well, that, you know, can that be some sort of a model for how we might move forward in trying to bring some of the, you know, aspects of mechanistic agriculture together with these more traditional local knowledge farms?
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons I'm really interested in this like field of research of like integrating not only the heritage of agriculture but also the ecology and the new research methods, because we need to. But you're right. I mean, I started out with a very romanticized vision of agriculture, not realizing the toll it had, the inequities, like gender inequities it had in traditional societies. So it's important to realize that heritage was, any type of heritage was a response to that social environment that these people lived in. But as the world changes, as their migration patterns changes, their responses to their social and natural environment also needs to change. And this is where I feel research into specific methods, like the one on pest control is brilliant, because pest is a problem for us in our farm, and just to learn like, oh, like diversifying your farm actually helps, you know. So this is something I feel has a lot of value in the future, I think.
So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you for a great panel session. Our next panel is Governance of Diversified Farming Systems, and Ignacio Chapella from Associate Professor in Espen is going to speak. And the title of his talk is Detect, Monitor, Map, When Microbes Become Disruptive.
When microbes become disruptive, is time running?
I will let you get your stuff together first here. The trick is not to open your mouth yet. I won't start the stopwatch until you say something.
It is weird, isn't it? I'm putting up in a governance panel. I want to work about a method and a gadget, and yet I'm going to spend time talking about the problem with your eyes. There's a problem when you think about it with your eyes. That most important organ that really defines most of what we do in science as well as in governance, what you see becomes what you care about and becomes what you talk about. All of ecology is done on organisms that we see, that we can count one by one and so on and so forth. And yet, a lot of the transformations that are happening in agricultural systems as well as other systems, most of the ecological phenomena that are happening in the invisible world. More than 98% of the species are invisible. They are in the domain of the microbial, which is where I am licensed to practice. And so it is also true that your eyes and the eyes of people and things that people care about get in the way of who counts, who makes decisions, and what are decisions made about. So in that sense, I guess what I do makes some sense in this panel. I became first confronted with this a long time ago when I was working with some of those people in Mesoamerica that end up working over here, and with the problem of the introgression or the movement of transgenic pieces of DNA into their crops, especially corn. This is a very interesting case example because it is a transformation of diversity that is completely invisible, and by the time you realize, by the time you're able to somehow see, it's usually too late. And you are very deep into a problem where you have absolutely no moorings. And the problem becomes even more serious when you have a monopolization of the viewing, of the actual detection. As it is today, the detection of transgenic sequences is monopolized by two companies, particularly one that charges about $300 to $400 a pop, one determination, which establishes a net over the world of what can be seen and what cannot be seen, what can be said about it and not. The problem continues to be very present, not only in terms of transgenic, but in other terms, in trying to determine how is diversity changing before you can actually see it. For example, a case that I'm working with in El Salvador right now. But it is a problem that is common for my folk, for microbial ecologists, in which you really try to make statements about what's happening in the invisible with very little access to materials and so on, so that you talk about detecting something. And you detect the presence of an anthrax spore, and you go ballistic, and you get front page stories, and so on and so forth. When in reality, that doesn't really mean too much. People talk about monitoring and maintaining some kind of multi-year detection over time and over space. But that also is very limited. The goal here should be, and I think many of us here in Berkeley share the goal of actually being able to map. And we undertook with people in my lab the task of establishing what principles would you use to map that invisible world. And we ended up with a very nutty and very recalcitrant problem that is just completely technical. We are working to develop a method and an actual gadget that allows us already, even though in a primitive way, to look at the invisible world in the air, the particles, any particle that carries DNA or RNA in the air, and then being able to transfer that onto a map, all those techniques, I don't need to explain, and be able to produce maps. To do that, you have to go from one pop for $300 or $400 to about a few million for a couple of bucks. That is the challenge that we have undertaken, and that is the challenge that we are trying to push. Very technical. I never imagined that I would be engaged in such a technical, mechanical, gadget-making effort, but it's one that, strangely enough, seems to be very inspiring and very germinal in the sense of producing a capability that would be available for a very low price to local people, local groups of people, so that they could become less centralized and less dominated by central points of governance and control. So that by being able to see these maps, they would be able to decide who counts, who makes decisions over what. Thank you.
So the library is going to speak on natural resource governance with First Nations, negotiating collaborations for eco-cultural restoration in the Pacific Northwest.
I think it just needs a bit of time.
Thanks. Okay, sorry for the delay. My name is Sybil Diver, and I'm a PhD student in ESPM, environmental science, and work with my guiding professor, Stephanie Carlson. So I'm specifically interested in natural resource governance with indigenous communities in the context of Pacific Northwest salmon watersheds. And I'm researching co-management, which is the sharing of power and responsibility of managing natural resources between local people and governments. And the two cases I'm working with are with the Karuk tribe in Northern California and the Hakka indigenous community in British Columbia. So you can see the Klamath River Basin is the Karuk, and Fraser River is with the Hakka. And just to be upfront, I'm not really working on institutional agriculture, but more around the harvest and management of wild plants and animals, salmon fisheries, and ethnobotany, the idea of looking at the forest as a place where humans are cultivating the landscape. And in both cases, the community is working through co-management agreements to implement a strategy of ecological and cultural restoration, so eco-cultural restoration for short. And I think these cases may inform people's interest in multifunctional agriculture in two ways. So first, eco-cultural restoration is perhaps a model for more holistic management that looks at how ecology and culture are being co-produced on the landscape. And then second, co-management is one approach to understanding and creating collaborative governance systems that have the potential to incorporate community values or not. And so to provide the brief context for this, here's some images from the area in the Hakka community, which an area the Hakka now refers to as Hakka Survival Territory. And in the 1990s, the Hakka were negotiating with the provincial government of British Columbia on integrated resource management and treaty rights. Here's some images just showing these are salmon fishing peoples. They've been on this land for about 9,000 years. And Hakka community has also conducted traditional use interviews and also developed an ecosystem-based plan to analyze culturally and ecologically sensitive areas within the territory and develop their own plan for sustainable resource management. And this is just a map showing the combination of some of this information. And so after about 10 years of negotiating with the provincial government, Oakland has received a community forest tenure for their land, which they're now operating on Aboriginal territory. So legally, this is Crown-owned land, but the project is co-managed with the Ministry of Forestry and is operated by the Hakka Community Forest Corporation. It's also guided by the ecosystem-based plan, which is essentially a silviculture, a community-driven silviculture plan. So switching watersheds here, this is an image, this is some of the community forest management happening. So switching watersheds here, this is an image from my study site in the Klamath River. And this area, Tea Creek, is Aboriginal territory of the Karuk tribe. It's now federally owned and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. The tribe has engaged in a co-management demonstration project here, and one project goal is to restore low-intensity cultural burning. And the Karuk tribe has written an eco-cultural restoration plan that articulates how Karuk fire management interacts with the landscape and with cultural resources. So the tribe is planning really to address how fire suppression has led to dense coniferous forests, which in turn have multiple impacts on fisheries and also on culturally important plants used for baskets, for example. And they hope to address some of these restoration challenges through their plan and the upcoming 2010 Climate Basin Restoration Agreement. So, in closing, my research is really about how these co-management processes have been negotiated and implemented. And I'm particularly interested in 3 problems in the co-management literature, which I'll investigate through the case. The first problem is that of different worldviews, and particularly with co-managers negotiating different cultural worldviews, as Paul Nadasi talks about, and how are these worldviews translated into actual management practices on the ground. The second is I'm concerned with co-management and sovereignty. So I think that the sovereignty literature can inform how co-management of natural resources on contested territory affects the broader power relations of indigenous communities and state governments. And then last, there's the problem of co-management and hegemony, which can operate through coercion and consent, and in some cases, this may threaten to co-opt community partnerships, but in other cases, it might allow an opportunity for the community to resist dominant resource management approaches which have been placed on their land. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to more conversation.
Okay, next we have Morgan Levy in the Energy and Resources Group. The missing ag water record, piecing together unknowns on California farm water use from historical agricultural data.
This is a project that's kind of in build-up to a master's thesis. I'm a first-year master's PhD student in Earth. And what I'm trying to do is reconstruct a longer-term historical record of water use for agriculture in California based on agricultural data. The problem is that we have water records and we have ag records, and they're not really combined in the sense that we can look back over the long term and say how agriculture in the state and in county and local and regional levels are using water. Most of my research questions at this point focus on the potential takeaways from the development of a combined ag-water record. So how does agriculture respond to shifts in water supply availability at regional and local scales, and then can that inform climate change adaptation efforts in the ag sector? Do these historical shifts in acreage, production, and water use tell us anything about the feasibility of proposals for improved agricultural water stewardship? And are improvements in water efficiency linked to the larger sustainability movement in agriculture in general? The problem is that this is difficult mainly because these sources of information are not created to convey historical connections between two separate resources. Some of these problems are just that the geographic boundaries are different in how they collect water and agricultural data. The water data specifically can be inconsistent and incomplete and then inaccessible at some levels. And then third, economists thankfully love agriculture, and they keep pretty consistent, detailed records over time. And that makes it a very useful set of data to draw agricultural information and water use. This is my plan as to how I'm going to approach this. The idea is to connect county agricultural data with state agency and water district water supply records over the past 50 years. I've done preliminary effort about 20 years in, and I haven't really selected the exact counties and historical moments and water districts that I might want to focus in on. Those are some of the sources that I'm going to use. They're a combination of agriculture and water agency data. This is an example. This is the 2007 to 2009 drought in the San Joaquin Valley, Fresno, Kern, and Kings County. I don't know if you guys can see this at all, but basically what this shows left to right, top to bottom, is the water available to this area in the valley. It's decreasing. At first, maybe, I don't know if you guys can see the axes, but it's million acre feet on the side. Then we have total harvested acres, and the vertical axis is millions of acres, also decreasing over the course of the drought. The block in the background is year 2000, which is a normal water year. The first bar is 2006, which is a wet water year. Again, this is a drought, 2007 through 2009 are a drought. So we have decreasing water, we have decreasing acreage, and then we have something a little bit confusing down at the bottom, which is that the tons of the top crop commodities, which are the crop commodities that bring these districts the highest revenue, that yield was steady, slightly decreasing, and the values, the total production values brought in by the crops in these 3 counties was steady and slightly decreasing. Nevertheless, both these 2 bottom charts higher, well, not so much with the tons of top crops, but production values for the most part higher than 2000 levels, and in terms of tons of top crops, a little bit, higher, and then in the production values also higher than 2006. So this is a complex picture of a drought that we can pair up with kind of a lot of the stuff we've heard in the media about what happened during the drought in Central Valley agriculture, which we all know is largely commercial ag, and there was a lot of confusion as to who was hurt and who wasn't, and jobs lost. And, this is the kind of analysis that we might be able to do if we can combine these records over the long term. This is at the state level, crop per drop in California over the past 20 years. And what we have at the top are just numbers per acre foot of water. An acre foot of water is about a foot of water over an acre of land. It's a common measurement in water. So we have yield per acre foot, which has increased in the long term. Harvested acres per acre foot have remained relatively steady, and crop production value per acre foot has also increased in the long term. The bottom chart down here is just the fluctuations in crop types, fruit and nut crops, field and seed crops, and vegetable and melon crops, which are the major crop categories grown in California, and how those have shifted relative to this 2000 year, or to the baseline total. So the total you see has remained relatively steady, and these are harvested acres per acre foot of water. So for every acre foot applied, the number of acres that we are harvesting out of them. And so what we see is we see an increase in the harvested acres per acre foot in field and seed crops, and a decrease in vegetable and melon crops, and something along the lines of a steady fruit and nut crop harvested acreage per acre foot of water. So these are a couple examples of the kinds of things we might be able to look at if we had this long-term historical record where we have combined water and agricultural records in terms of acres, crop production, and crop values. There's a lot of places I could go from this. There are a lot of questions I could ask. I think that probably pertain to what you guys work on. But at this point, this is where I am, and this is hopefully what I'll continue to work on at least for the next year to complete my master's.
Okay, and our last talk in this panel is Patrick Bauer. He's a PhD student at ESPO, the social construction of urban food belts.
Appropriate technology.
That's definitely light here. So a bit of a strange rush coming from the audience. So I want to take this opportunity today to highlight an area of inquiry that I think deserves more attention, not just here at DFS, but at the broader societal level as well. So I'm a first-year PhD student, and so what I'm going to be talking about today is more the development of the research plan as opposed to sort of already completed research. One of the reasons that I came here to Berkeley, one of the questions that I wanted to look at was to explore whether the movement for environmental sustainability, broadly speaking, is compatible with the progressive movement toward equity amongst people, and how. And that's a very broad question, but it seems to me that we have a piece of it before us here in the work that DFS is doing. And this has come out in some of the other talks that we've heard this afternoon. And I think that we have a responsibility really to ask whether the norms to which proponents of diversified farming systems ascribe are supportive of, or at least consistent with, the goals of social justice in the wider agri-food system. So today I'm going to focus on what I think is a very accessible point of connection between diversified farming systems and social justice, and that's food access, particularly in urban centers, and I'm going to focus on Chicago. So some of you may be familiar with the term food desert, and if you're not, the next time you take the BART going south and you're approaching the West Oakland stop, just take a look out the train to the right. And you'll get a pretty good picture of West Oakland, which has been widely described as a food desert. And a food desert is an area with limited or no availability of healthy food. And it's related to what the USDA terms food insecurity, which in 2008 affected 17 million American households. It's about 15% of all Americans living with food insecurity, which is limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. In such conditions of poor nutritional quality of and access to food contribute to national epidemics of obesity and diabetes and other nutrition-related diseases. So this is a really big deal. And the way that it's often described in urban settings is food deserts, which is an attempt to recognize the structural and geographic and place effects on the ability of individuals to access good and healthy sorts of food. The way this generally works out is, food deserts are interpreted to be areas where there are no stores. This is supermarkets and grocery stores that sell produce, fresh meats, whole grains, things like that. In the past several years, concern over the perceived food desert crisis has really veritably exploded. And so we see public health and planning officials from city governments to the federal level, local and national media, community groups, and even private corporations and so forth, getting excited about this issue. In February 2010, for example, Michelle Obama gave a speech where she pledged to get $400 million going toward the elimination of food deserts in this country over the next 7 years. So a lot of activity. In Chicago, a 2006 report, and this is one of the first reports that kind of highlighted this issue, claimed that 1 in 5 Chicagoans, 1 in 5 is 20% of all Chicagoans, live in a food desert. Clearly became a big issue in Chicago politics. And several corporate food retailers, including Walmart, Walgreens, and the sort of internet-based delivery service Peapod, took interest in dealing with this issue. And I want to focus on the role of Walmart in particular, which has, for the first time in decades, managed to really infiltrate the Chicago market, in part based on the rationale that they're going to help alleviate food desert conditions. So just last month, Chicago announced that 6 new Walmarts will be opening up in Chicago. They've been traditionally blocked by labor unions and so forth. But because of this food desert paradigm, they're able to sort of make a case for themselves. And so what I want to explore is, Nathan mentioned earlier that NGOs around urban farming and so forth might be coming in to fill some of the gaps left by receding government services. And so my topic of research that I'm interested in is the way in which private corporations like Walmart might also be fulfilling a similar role, where government is delegating some of its authority and some of its responsibility for providing services to private corporations such as Walmart. And so I want to think more broadly about governance in that regard, and I'll stop there because I'm way over.
Okay, well, all the panelists from that last session could come up. We can ask them some questions. So Patrick, when you get back, Sybil, Ignacio, and Morgan. Yeah.
That's a good question.
For Sybil, you're just as far as considering kind of the historic aspects of government native tribe relations, what sort of optimism is there for actually crafting like kind of viable, I guess, contractual frameworks or something for this? I'm just thinking the Karuk, like that's all federally and state managed lands, right? Pretty much mostly, because that's private. areas, and it seems that, well, I was just saying in the context of taking out the dams, I think how much power can these tribes expect to have over land management aspects in these co-management frameworks, and how does that work? How does it ensure that they're able to do it?
I think that's a really good question, and it, from what I learned so far, it seems very context specific, and you know, depending on what power you're coming from, then that affects your strategy of moving forward. And so in the Carib's case, they have been very disempowered, and they probably have less power than the other tribes in that same basin. It sounds like you already know. They don't have a reservation base, for example, but they do have trust land. So the way that they are engaging is they're very bought into partnership strategies. And so the collaborative strategy is their strategy because they have few resources. And so that's very particular to the Carib tribe, I think, in this case. I don't, you know, that might apply to other communities, but it might not. So they have engaged as, you know, engaged around some of the communities concerned for Indigenous rights, and they use that to insert themselves in direct negotiations, collaborations with the agencies, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service. But it's very interesting because the history of the Forest Service is very conflicted. Their traditional lands were basically are now managed by the Forest Service. Fish and Wildlife they have a better relationship with, and you know, because the day-to-day management challenges are less threatening. So it's a complex landscape. But, yeah, thanks. We talked for an hour about that.
All right.
Question for Ignacio. With the detection of transgenes in populations of corn, for example, I'm interested in knowing what kind of expression are we starting to see in some of these populations? Are the users of these crops beginning to actually see the expression of these transgenes?
No, the expression is not seen in any way different from the expression of, you know, commercial varieties, and it doesn't mean that that nothing is happening. The big problem with transgenics, specifically transgenics, is that nobody has really done any testing, and there is no way to connect who is being exposed or who is getting what or doing what with what is being planted, because there is no tracking. And so there are many stories about people, yes, seeing monsters and things happening that are very serious and so on, but the bottom line is that there isn't the possibility of looking at it carefully and in a reliable way. So it's one of those situations where you cannot really use your eyes at all. We just don't know. And we don't know because we don't have enough possibility of really knowing where these things are. Are they going up? Are they going down? In that corner of the field or in that part of the region, what's the spatial structuring of these populations? So nobody knows.
Yasi?
I have a question for Morgan. So we know that 80% of the water comes down from the Delta is going to agriculture. The rest is municipal and industry. What are you hoping that will come of your research, and what connection between usage of the water and farms? Because regulation obviously is very, very difficult, and that's why it hasn't been at the U.S. for regulation of water usage to make it more efficient. So what do you hope to do?
The thing is that just in my past research, what became evident is I wanted to know how farm water use held up right now against the longer term on farms. That information just literally isn't available. And so I can't decide to say, well, have farms in the Central Valley or anywhere in the state actually become more efficient over the long term, which is sometimes something they say, which may or may not be true, but there's different ways of doing that. I spent the last year interviewing farmers about how they irrigate, and that yields a different set of information, and this yields a different set of information. And the thing is it's kind of an exercise in trying to create a new data set that allows me to ask different questions, which is just, what is the story of water use in California over the past 50 years, and what types of crops lend to what types of water responses and what types of water infrastructure has been built that serves different types of crops. And none of those questions can be asked without a historical record. And then I also I have this feeling that if you have a historical record, it enables you to ask the right, more better questions, which then enables you to potentially create better policies for how different farming systems or how more sustainable agriculture can be put in place in this state, which informs regulation. But I understand that policy moves forward before there's information, and that's normally how things happen. But I like to believe that if we have a better understanding of history, it does lend towards being able to say how we might better use our water resources, and if that matches up with this kind of larger agricultural sustainability movement. We don't know, and I don't think anyone can say that unless you have a larger historical record.
This question is for Patrick. First, thank you for speaking about food deserts. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. So, as you probably know, the role of a lot of grassroots organizations in addressing food deserts is to kind of affect the structural inequalities that have created the food deserts. So, do you think this entry of Walmart into this problem of food deserts is hurting the structural changes, or do you think there's potential to enable the structural change?
I mean, I think that you sort of hit the nail, at least partly on the head, one of the nails with that question. Certainly I think there's an issue with whether or not Walmart coming in as a response to a food desert sort of crisis in an urban community actually does address some of these cultural changes. I mean, there's quite a bit of controversy right now as to whether a Walmart even actually creates jobs, given that there's some evidence that it tends to suck up retail business from other local businesses in the area. And the sort of broader agri-food system in terms of security and even the sorts of sustainability and resiliency and diversified sorts of farming systems that we're interested in from an agriculture and farming perspective. I think that Walmart also doesn't necessarily address some of the structural issues in that regard either. It's interesting because a corporation like Walmart is statutorily obligated to be focused on profit making. I mean, it's their top priority, and that's enshrined in law. And so to put upon a corporation like Walmart the responsibility of meeting these social obligations, to give people food, to give people jobs, to promote sustainable sorts of agriculture that isn't polluting the environment in various ways, it's not harming biodiversity and so forth, really seems to me a bit of a dodge, frankly, on the part of local and state and federal government to really deal with some of the underlying issues and structural issues. So I mean, I think that there's problems from Walmart's end, but it's also not fair to expect a corporation like Walmart to fulfill these requirements to begin with.
Gareth, you have a question?
So you sort of just answered it, but do you have and it may be too early to ask in research, but do you have a sense, are you going to do kind of a comparative analysis in the ability of Walmart to water these deserts, or means an index of efficiency perhaps for private companies versus public agency to solve these problems?
I mean, so one thing that I'd like to look at is using Walmart and framing it as a sort of central node that's connecting this agri-food system at a regional scale. And also at a national scale. I mean, Walmart's an international corporation, obviously. But just in taking Chicago for example, Walmart is connecting as the central node all sorts of farmers. And so Walmart started selling local and organic foods if you're not aware. So Walmart's connecting all these farmers, out into DeKalb and central Illinois and so forth, with all of these urban consumers in downtown Chicago. But Walmart's the center of that. So if anything happens to Walmart, if we rely on it, then the whole system is kind of going to kind of a lot of trouble. And I mean, I think we've noticed with the recent recession that too big to fail isn't an adage that works. And I think we need to take that into account when thinking about the role of Walmart in such a situation as well. But I want to think about Walmart and use it as a lens through which to explore possibilities for alternative forms of governance, for alternative forms of linking together farmers and agricultural areas with urban food access through this distribution idea. So new scales of governance and new forms that are more accountable, hopefully more resilient, more sustainable, and more just.
Well, both questions were pretty much just asked. The only other thing I was going to say was, I think I heard at a recent lecture that Walmart is now taking the organic produce off of the shelves, that it's decided against that. That's what I've heard. And I don't know if that's everywhere or just some regions. So I was going to ask how that might impact.
That's news to me. I haven't heard, so I can't comment.
Okay.
I'd be interested, yeah, maybe we can talk after. I'm interested to hear the video.
It came around somewhere. Maybe it was news from
One last burning question. Robin. Mary, sorry.
I've been trying to formulate this as a question. I haven't maybe gotten there yet, but I'm interested in the question of technology and sort of innovation versus restoration, and maybe technology thought about more broadly as sets of practices as well as machines. And Sybil, you've talked in some ways about restoration, and you were talking about sort of technological innovation that would enable a kind of visibility for things to be seen. And I'm wondering, sort of, and other speakers have talked about sort of the synthesis of old techniques with new technologies like drip irrigation. So how we're thinking about sort of technology and innovation, how that gets diffused and developed in sort of a general arena. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about it.
I guess you're looking at me. That is a subject that is very deep and very, my lab thinks a lot about that problem. And the one thing I can say, with a few seconds, is that to be conscious about this question is something that's rare in a situation where you are producing any kind of technological intervention, as you say, as through a gadget or through a practice. And I think part of what behooves us here is to really be open to that question, instead of saying, no, I'm the one who produces the machines, you guys figure out how to make people accept them, which is basically what our campus has boiled down to. And we do ethics to try and convince people that everything is fine, rather than asking the right questions. And I think it behooves us to just keep this in the forefront. In fact, the decision to go into this very ambitious project that is very technically oriented, was a very conscious one on my part, to really enter into discourse with that reality that our campus has, as well as the world. And I'm putting some kind of tension. The design of what we're doing we're trying to produce things that by design cannot be centralized. That is really the central challenge. How do you design something that cannot be centralized by design, and therefore produces a distributive capacity that makes people more independent rather than more dependent on me? The words really fail to convey the problems, because when you talk about technology, you can mean many different things. When you talk about citizen science, which is a very popular term, you also mean very different things that are very contradictory. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Let's thank.
Yeah, sure. So
can I make a brief comment about because I really like this idea about applying technologies to restoration, and I hadn't thought about that before. And I think that there's an opportunity to think about technologies as a traditional technology, but then also as a new science technology, and it kind of links back to what Andy was talking about, and Laura Ann, about this idea of how do you take from past technologies but also move them forward, and then at the same time take from developing ideas. And I think that some of the fire management work that's being done in the campus is really interesting in that respect, of taking from past knowledges but also using very modern fire science, and that it's kind of an opportunity to break down thinking about this as an opportunity to break down this divide between the idea of fire as a cultural management practice, a traditional old management process versus fire as a contemporary. It's actually both. And then we've actually got culture that has produced the landscape as we used to know it in both climate, and now it's basically a current fire management strategy. But it's still the fire management maybe as a technology, as a restoration technology that is really being, I think, identified as a key part of the restoration planning. And I just wanted to comment on that because there was this really nice themes today about kind of past, present, future knowledges. So.
Great. Let's thank all of these.